Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 17 in our continuing study of the book of Proverbs. We're still in that section, chapters 10 through 24, one verse maxims, and we subdivided that. We had the righteous versus the wicked, chapters 10 through 15. Now we're in this second section, living the wise life, and things to come. And when we get to chapter 2, verse 17, we'll actually be introducing that section with the phrase, these are the words of the wise, but that's still in the future. Chapter 17, verse 1 Better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of feasting with strife. Now, think about this. Quietness is better than strife. Even if there's not a lot of food, even if there's not a lot of riches, strife, when you're eating a lot, can actually lead to indigestion. And that's the point here. Verse 2 A servant who acts wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully. Now, that's just the first line, that's just the first part of the proverb. We continue that same thought, we finish it up, and we'll share in the inheritance among brothers. So notice a son has a much lower position than a servant. Or a servant, yeah, I should say, has a much lower position than a son. And yet, if it's tempered with wisdom, a low position isn't as detrimental as foolishness is. A son who acts shamefully. So notice the better versus the best. We had both the better is the dry morsel and better is the servant, even though we didn't use that actual term. The idea is there. Verse 3 The refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. Notice real value, and we could sort of trace this back to those previous two proverbs. Real value isn't about the morsel, but it's the quietness instead of the strife. Real value isn't about holding a position of servant instead of son, but it's whether or not you're acting wisely. Real value isn't for silver or gold, but it's in the heart. Verse 4 An evildoer listens to wicked lips. Now, notice wicked lips, we're going to talk about foolish words. An evildoer listens to wicked lips. A liar pays attention to a destructive tongue. There's an old saying that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's actually not true. Words can destroy you, especially if you listen to them. Notice the evildoer listens to the wicked lips. The liar pays attention to a destructive tongue. He may not be making up the lies on his own. He may be getting them from other places. Verse 5 He who mocks the poor taunts his maker. He who rejoices at calamity, rejoicing is nice, but not at calamity, at bad things that happen, will not go unpunished. Verse 6 Grandchildren are the crown of old men, and the glory of sons is their father. So notice, now how does this relate to verses 4 and 5? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it stands alone. When that happens, that doesn't bother us, unless we pick up the same theme in the next verse, which here I think we do. Notice we had the crown and the glory, the grandchildren of the fathers, but now in verse 7, excellent speech, we're back to words. Excellent speech is not fitting for a fool, much less our lying lips. Do you remember wicked lips and a destructive tongue? Now it's excellent speech, but that doesn't match up with a fool. You don't actually see, they don't go together. Much less are lying lips for a prince. Now, that's not to say you cannot have a prince who lies, but it shouldn't match up. It just doesn't fit. Something's wrong with that picture. And so we have, notice, foolish words, family honor, and now appropriate words. Notice how that's sandwiched in there. And maybe that makes us look at this short little proverb about family honor in a way in which people speak. Grandchildren are the crown of old men. And maybe something happens there in speech that causes those grandchildren to be the crown. Maybe those old men are giving some speech, some lessons along the way. Likewise, the glory of sons is their fathers, and their fathers have taught them and spoken them to them, and now that goes in an appropriate way. Verse 8, a bribe is a charm in the sight of its owner. Wherever he turns, he prospers. Now, let me just say, this is a difficult proverb. That term bribe, Shochad is the Hebrew word, and that term, the King James Version renders this a gift instead of a bribe. A gift is a precious stone in the eyes of him that hath it. Whithersoever it turneth, it prospereth. So notice the big change there. The rest of it is pretty much the same. I know it's Old English, so it's a little bit hard to follow. But should we render this as a bribe or a gift? Well, that's the question. And to answer that, we look at the different ways the same term is used elsewhere in the Hebrew text of the scriptures. Whenever we see this word, shokad, used anywhere in the Old Testament scriptures, it always has a negative connotation. Let's look at some examples. Exodus chapter 23, verse 8, you shall not take a shokad, a bribe. For a shokad, a bribe, blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of justice, of the just. Obviously, it's a negative thing. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17, it describes God who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. Now, I'm not saying the term always has a negative connotation anywhere just because of the word, but it does in the Old Testament. Let's look at another example. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 3. And this is the sons of Samuel. His sons took bribes and perverted justice. Now, two possible interpretations, since we are evidently, I think, to take it in a negative sense. Shokad, it's not a gift, it's a bribe. That's what a bribe is. It's a gift, but it's a gift with particular implications. One is that it's describing the fool who thinks that bribes are a shortcut to prosperity. The fool that we've seen already in verses 4 and 5, and again in verse 7, who's thinking that this is the case, and that's possible. Another way of seeing this is to point out that just the truth, because sometimes Proverbs don't tell you what should happen. Sometimes they just tell you what happens so that you can be aware, so that you can know. And maybe this proverb is just pointing out that bribes often work in accomplishing their desired purposes, not to say that you should go and do likewise. It's not saying that you should do likewise, but wisdom is recognizing that bribes sometimes happen. And that's not a call to give or to receive bribes, but it's just saying go into the world with your eyes open, know what happens so that you can be aware. Verse 9, he who conceals a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. Um, again, just telling you the way things happen. Is concealing a transgression good? It depends on if you're trying to get on somebody's good side or not. It depends on the situation. Again, maybe it's just telling you the way things work. Repeating a matter it can separate friends. Should it be done? Again, it depends on the situation. There are some things that should be covered up. If you have a great friend and he commits a terrible crime, you shouldn't necessarily cover up for him. Maybe it should be reported and justice should be done. See, it depends on the situation. So notice concealing a transgression versus repeating a matter. Those are in tension between the two. And what to do, that's going to be the call for wisdom. So one seeks love, one breaks friendship. Be aware of that and let the, I want to say, let the chips fall where they may. Make your decision accordingly. Verse 10, a rebuke goes deeper into one who has understanding than 100 blows into a fool. Now, notice this is sort of a synthetic parallel. That is, you begin the proverb in the first line, and then the second line, 100 blows into a fool. That's finishing the thought, because if you just say the first line, it's incomplete. It doesn't really tell you the whole story of what you're to see. So a rebuke goes deeper into one who has understanding. Think about it. You can say, hey, don't do that, and get the attention of someone who has understanding, or you can you can keep hitting a fool and he still won't get it. And so notice rebuke versus a fool. A rebuke is of more value to the wise than 100 blows. The fool's not going to get the rebuke, and maybe maybe he's just got to learn the hard way. Incidentally, there's a lesson there. I used to tell my firefighters, I was a battalion chief with the fire department in my younger years. I used to tell my firefighters, if you're going to be dumb, you better be tough. Be ready for those 100 blows because it's going to hurt, and not that I'm going to hit you, but the fire ground and life is going to hit you if you keep making the same mistake again and again and again. Verse 11, a rebellious man seeks only evil. So a cruel messenger will be sent against him. Now that term messenger, malak, uh, that's actually, and it can mean messenger, or it can mean, the same term can mean what we would call a divine messenger, in other words, an angel. Um, Although it doesn't necessarily have to refer, in either case, to a person. You say, aren't angels people? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying, in other words, a bad thing can happen. That can be a messenger as well. Um, Sometimes you're not paying attention and you hammer in a nail and you hit your thumb, and that was I got a message. I had to be paying attention. It wasn't that there was a messenger or an angel or something like that. So I don't have to personalize it, but maybe I could. But notice a rebellious man seeks only evil, and he may suffer the results of it, either through a messenger that sends some bad news, or an angel, or just the natural results of what takes place as a result of that. Verse 12, let a man meet a bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in his folly. Notice again, this is one of those better or worse. A bear robbed of her cubs is just a wicked thing to meet. Bears can be sort of nasty in the best circumstances, but a mother bear, you mess with her cubs have been killed or hurt or somehow, you're just in for a problem. And yet, as bad as that is, much worse, a fool in his folly, because that can take you down just as permanently. Verse 13 is now going to bring us a new theme, perhaps alluded to in the verse just before, but we're going to take this as a new theme: wisdom in the face of strife. So, he who returns evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. Now, notice that term evil, ra'ah. That can refer either to moral evil, like when you do something that's just wicked, it's against God's law, or it can refer to a natural calamity, or maybe a man-made calamity. It's just a bad thing. So he who returns a bad thing for good, in other words, that can be, he responds with something not very nice. It might be a moral evil, or it might be a slap in the face or something. But he returns evil for good. Evil, again, that could be moral evil, or it could be this calamity will not depart from his house. I think both senses are going to be sort of strife. In other words, he who returns strife, somebody treated him well, and he didn't treat them very nice. He, snapped back a nasty answer, or he did something not very nice to that person. Not very niceness will not depart from his house. He's sort of setting the stage as to where he's going to live, what his life will look like. Verse 14, the beginning of strife is like letting out water. So abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Now, letting out water, think about this. When you, and they didn't necessarily have bottles, they did have clay jars, but beginning to let out water, that sort of presupposes maybe I've got water in a jar and it begins to leak. Well, what happens? If I don't do anything, it just keeps coming. If anything, it might get worse. Have you ever seen a dam that begins to leak? And after a while, that dam breaks and it leads to a breakage. So the beginning of strife is like letting out water. It might leak out and begin to seep out, but it's not going to stop. It's just going to grow. So abandon the quarrel, abandon that strife before it breaks out, before it just lets loose. And now it's just all over the place. Verse 15, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous, both of them, notice it's not just describing one thing, but two things, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord. Why is there a price in the hand of a fool to buy wisdom when he has no sense? Now we're going to be introducing fools. Fools and friends, and this is a rhetorical question. Notice The first line and the second line finishes it, but it's asks a question but doesn't really give an answer. And that's because the answer is obvious. Why is there a price in the hand of a fool to buy wisdom when he has no sense? Well, it's just foolishness. He's not going to benefit from wisdom. So, like I said, the question is rhetorical. Verse 17, still about friends. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Um, a good friend is a friend who is with you. He's ready there all the time. It doesn't matter if it's a good time, a bad time, if you made a good decision, a bad decision, a friend will be there. And notice, friend and brother sort of go together. Some friends you make, some you're born with. Hopefully, your siblings are your friends. If they're not, then shame on the both of you. But a brother is born for adversity. That the idea there is that one who is that close to you can be there in the worst times. Verse 18, a man lacking sense. Now notice we had the bad in the case of the the fool who has no sense, and we're continuing that adversity theme. A man lacking in sense pledges and becomes guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. So this is taking verse 16 and verse 17 together about friends, and now we see this person who he's acting the part of the fool, and yet he pledges, he binds himself in sort of a financial friendship. He makes partnership, becomes a guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. In other words, he binds himself. That might not be a good decision. Notice he was lacking sense. If he saw better, gee, that it's one thing for me to help out a friend, but if I'm guaranteeing him, if I'm putting my possessions, not just helping him, not just giving him some possessions, but I'm guaranteeing a bad loan that he made, I might be the one who's left holding the bag. So notice how there's sort of a flow of thought in friends, and yet be wise in that. So notice there was the good, the friend loves at all time, and a brother born for adversity. But here, verse 18, that's the bad, because he's lacking in sense, and then he pledges, and now he takes on a responsibility that if he knew better, he wouldn't have taken on in the first place. Still on fools and friends, verse 19, he who loves transgression loves strife. That's a bad thing. He who raises his door seeks destruction. Now, raises his door seems to be a figure of speech, because just opening your door doesn't mean anything. But in other words, he's opening it to sin and to strife, and take those two in parallel together. They are two ways of saying the same thing. When you come across that and you have a figure of speech or maybe a phrase and you say, I'm not sure what that means, look at the parallel. That helps to define it. So he loves transgression. Now, you contrast that with verse 17. Remember, there's a friend that loves all the time. That's a good thing. But one who loves transgression, that's not a good thing. And he who raises his door seeks destruction. Figure of speech. The New Revised Standard Version renders this: one who builds a high threshold invites broken bones. Now think about that. In other words, he trips. He doesn't put his door where he ought to put it, so he trips over it, and he's going to trip over it, and he's going to break an arm, and that's not a good thing. Or the New Jerusalem Bible, the proud courts ruins. He raises his door. That is, he doesn't let uh, you know sort of just anybody go through. He's acting in pride. He's saying, I'm special. Courts ruin. So two different ways that's been rendered in trying to get the idea across. Verse 20, he who has a crooked mind, and we're still talking about fools and friends, he who has a crooked mind finds no good, and he who is perverted in his language falls into evil. So notice, one is what you're thinking, the other is what you're doing. Both are not good, and yet they lead to problems. Verse 21, he who sires a fool does so to his sorrow. Remember how we talked about children are the crown of their fathers? Well, that's true if your children do right. On the other hand, if you've given birth to a fool, oh goodness, that's just you're passing on an inheritance, a heritage, not of pride but of shame. And notice, he who sires a fool and the father of a fool has no joy. There's no pride. You can't take any pride when your children. Now, it's when sometimes children make mistakes. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about taking up the lifestyle of a fool. And remember, the fool is the one who said in his heart, according to Psalms, there is no God. He's rejected the wisdom of God, and that just leads to sorrow. Verse 22, a joyful heart is good medicine. So notice the repetition of the joy idea. The father of the fool had no joy, but a joyful heart is good medicine. Um, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. Now, this is one of our rare contrasts in this section. Remember, we said there's not all that many contrasts, but here's one of them. Joyful heart is a good medicine. Let me just say, it's healthy. Can I say it this way? It's healthy to be happy. It's healthy to rejoice. One of my cousins, he is an entertainer, Monique Marvez. She's a cousin on my mom's side, sort of an adopted cousin. Delightful entertainer, comedian, and she has an expression she loves to share. She says, get as happy as you can as quickly as you can. Now, let me put a spin on that, because real happiness is knowing the Lord. And in that sense, get as happy as you can, as quick as you can. But a broken spirit dries up the bones. Let me just say, unhappiness is not health. Unhappiness is not healthy. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Doesn't Jesus talk about happy as the one who is poor in spirit? Yes, I think there is something about that. That when we are poor in spirit, when we see our own need, and it's not that that changes, but then we find our need in Jesus. And that leads to a joyful heart. So you see how that works together here, even in this verse. Verse 23, a wicked man, and so we ask the question, is a broken spirit good or bad? It can be good if it leads to wholeness, because we find our wholeness in God, not in ourselves, but in God. All right. So remember, we had that term, shokad. A wicked man receives a bribe. Remember, we said that's not just a gift. That's got a negative connotation. A wicked man receives a bribe from the bosom to pervert the ways of justice. And so notice, these are fools and friends, and this is a bad friend who's taking a bribe in order, not just a bribe for any old reason, but actually to take justice and turn it around and make it injustice. Verse 24, we're still dealing with fools and friends. Wisdom is in the presence of the one who has understanding, but the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. Now, notice wisdom is right there with the wise. He lives it, he breathes it, he speaks it, he hears it. But with the fool, the eyes of the fool are on the ends of the earth. He's always looking for something. He's missed it. He's missed wisdom. It might be right next door, but he's looking for it from afar and never finding it. Verse 25, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. Remember how we were talking about sons would normally be the crown of the father. That's a great thing to have a son, unless he's a fool. And then that turns greatness into tragedy. It turns it into grief and bitterness, grief to his father, bitterness to her who bore him as his mother. And then finally, verse 26, it is also not good to fine the righteous, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. That is, you give a good reward to those who do good. You don't give them a bad reward. You don't punish good work. I used to believe that about my firefighters. If they did a great job, I didn't punish them by throwing a bunch of more busy work upon them. No, do your job and then enjoy the benefits of it. So don't punish good behavior, or you're going to make it run away. You're going to make it go away. Verse 27, he who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Notice cool spirit would be the opposite of hot tempered, that sort of thing. So here's somebody who has self control. In keeping with that, verse 28, even a fool, when he keeps silence, that's the same thing as restraining your words. Even a fool, when he keeps silence, is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is considered prudent. I often ask my students, can you think of times when you should have been quiet, but you spoke out and you wish you hadn't? And everybody raises their hands. And then I say, can you think of times when you should have spoken out and you remain quiet? And again, some hands go up because I can think of a few of those examples as well. But I can always think of more times when I should have kept silent and closed my lips instead of just blurting out something and it being terribly the wrong thing to say. I could probably say more, but perhaps this is a time to keep silent and to close my own lips.